Hi and hello, a little Murdock extra. This time a video I've already done before, but only in German. And I thought I'll do it again in English for those viewers who maybe discovered my channel after I switched to doing the videos in English. Now, I've done a Beatles ranking some time ago in German in full detail with a discography walkthrough, commenting on each of the albums in chronological order, and then at the end of the video giving my personal ranking of those albums. To be honest, there's no way I'm going to do all of that again in English, but I thought with this video for English-speaking viewers, I'll just give you my personal ranking. Now, what did I include? There are 13 studio albums by the Beatles, usually in the acknowledged studio release canon. I chose not to include the Yellow Submarine album because to me that's more a soundtrack and a compilation album, to be honest. There are a lot of songs included on that album which had already been released before on other albums, and the entire second half of the album actually is an orchestral score by George Martin. So to me, this never really was a full, proper Beatles studio release, to be honest. On the other hand, I include the Magical Mystery Tour in my list, originally only released as an EP and then padded out to become a full album for the American market. But I think this is an acceptable choice because I guess most Beatles fans nowadays would say that yes, indeed, Magical Mystery Tour is part of the proper studio album canon by the Beatles. Okay, enough technical chit-chat, and without much further ado, here is again my personal ranking of the 12 Beatles studio albums. It's super subjective and personal, and don't you dare to disagree. Last entry, and thus starting at the bottom of the list, the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me. Of course, this is a big bang album in terms of rock history, but listening to it now, I have to admit this is probably the Beatles album that has aged the worst. To me, it's foremost that, a historic document showing an early stage of the Beatles that kicked off a tremendous career. That notwithstanding, of course, there are some real corkers on this album, most notably the opening track I Saw Her Standing There, or the Beatles version of Twist and Shout. Their original songs on this album are cued to competent Mercy Beat originals, and there are some forgettable as well as some really interesting cover versions. Overall, some of the material still has a certain late 1950s feeling, to be honest. And yeah, on the whole, this simply is not an album I revisit a lot. So the list and the story of the Beatles had to start somewhere. My number 12, Please Please Me. At 11, 1964's Beatles for Sale. An album that saw the band in a bit of a transitional phase. They were also pretty exhausted by touring, by the entire craziness of Beatlemania around them. And that also shows on this album, which again is more or less 50-50 original material, which is good to very good, and some, to be honest, rather throwaway-ish cover versions simply to fill the album somehow. As mentioned, the Beatles were quite exhausted and at the same time very much under pressure of releasing new material. The most famous track from this album is the single 8 Days a Week, which is a really, really great Beatles song, but still not the best. There are a few noteworthy original entries. Personally, I think, however, this is definitely one of the weaker Beatles releases. And at number 10, the second Beatles studio album with the Beatles. It's definitely, again, not their best or the strongest 1960s album you'll ever hear. However, I would always argue that this is a bit of an underrated Beatles release. I think this one captures their Mercy beat phase the best. They clearly further develop their songwriting muscles on this album. It's more varied than the debut album. It's also more clearly in 1960s style, so it already sounded, I think, more modern at the time of its release. It's also the one Beatles album where they chose more R&B and soul material for their covers, which adds quite an interesting facet to their catalog. And despite some forgettable tracks here and there are a lot of really fun Beatles tracks on With the Beatles. The opening track, It Won't Be Long, for instance, is just a very, very fun Mercy beat rocker. I Wanna Be Your Man in the Beatles version with Ringo Starr singing is another Mercy beat classic. Paul McCartney contributed the cute and extremely catchy All My Loving. And then, as I've mentioned, there are some really cool cover choices. Most of all, Please Mr. Postman, which originally had been a Motown hit, and at the time of release of With the Beatles was already also still quite current. So the band really chose up-to-date material to give it their own Beatles treatment.
Number 9.
This album is amazingly consistent. It's pure 1960s beat fun and filled with tremendous early rock songs by the Beatles. Of course, it opens with the iconic A Hard Day's Night, which practically was hard rock with its aggressive electric guitars and its non-stop energy. There are wonderful ballads here, such as Paul McCartney's And I Love Her, but also tracks like the storming Can't Buy Me Love or the raucous You Can't Do That. On to my number 8 in my list, in my personal ranking list of the Beatles studio albums. And this is where I put an album that is a little bit hard to classify for me. I like it a lot, and at the same time, it clearly has its flaws. And the album I'm talking about is Let It Be, released in 1970, but actually not the last Beatles album, at least not the last Beatles album in order of recording sessions. This is where the Beatles tried one more time to, well, get back to their roots. Originally, the album also was intended to bear the title, Get Back. They recorded all of the material live, no overdubs, to come across or to demonstrate how they sounded and how they worked as a tight live band jamming in the studio. The material here ranges from excellent to a bit throwaway-ish. Most famously, of course, we get the title track Let It Be, which is a slightly gospel-infused ballad by Paul McCartney. But we also get some a bit overlooked, guitar-heavy, late 60s rock songs such as Dig a Pony or the excellent, phenomenal I've Got a Feeling. As I've said, some of the other entries on this album are really not the Beatles at their best, and most of all, the original production by none other than Phil Spector actually killed the idea, the basic idea of the Let It Be project a little bit, because he added a lot of overdubs, strings, his typical delay and echo-heavy production, and that actually takes away from the idea of presenting the Beatles in a very raw, intimate live setting. At number 7, the middle of my list and also the middle of the Beatles' career, the album Help. This is just a solid mid-1960s pop rock record where the Beatles sort of perfected and finalized the sound of their earlier years. It's the last album that you could refer to as having a Mersey beat sound. Of course, the title track is one of the great Beatles singles. And all in all, this album just has a wonderful flow. There are hardly any weak spots on this one. And the band's already sneaked in a few more thoughtful, more experimental songs. There are more acoustic moments. Most notably, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, which is, I think, one of the best acoustic Beatles tracks. The accompanying film, or actually the film that this album was made for, also is worth watching if you are into really over-the-top, very silly and quirky 1960s humor. Next up is my number 6, and this may be a little bit of a controversial entry in my list, because my number 6 spot is Abbey Road, the last album to be recorded by the Beatles, but not the last one that was released, because that was, of course, Let It Be. Well, a lot of fans rank this album very highly or even have it at their number 1 spot. There is no doubt that this is an iconic and classic album. However, I've always had a slight gripe with the celebrated Abbey Road medley that makes up most of the second side. To me, this always felt a little bit unfinished or a missed opportunity, because you can hear that they had these small unfinished song ideas that they simply strung together to produce a very well-flowing medley, but arguably you can hear that some of these songs simply weren't developed enough. And personally, I would have preferred a collection of more produced, more finished individual tracks. Nonetheless, there are, without any doubt, some of the very best Beatles songs of their entire career on this album, especially on side A with John Lennon's cool Come Together. We get 2 absolute George Harrison gems, Something, one of the most popular love ballad by the Beatles, and one of my absolute personal favorites, his acoustic pop, Here Comes the Sun. And if this wasn't enough to upset you, at my number 5 is the album that for years, well, maybe decades, usually topped the Beatles list and also various lists of best albums of all time. Of course, that can only be Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Indeed, you may be shaking your heads in disbelief now, but yes, this is only in my top 5 spot. Of course, indisputably, this is a milestone in rock and roll history, a hugely influential album, possibly the first ever concept album, even though it's a very, very loose concept, to be honest, and a very important album in terms of its revolutionary production. There's a handful of stone cold classics on this album. The title track, for example, the psychedelia anthem Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, or of course the epic closing track A Day in the Life. And yet there are other Beatles albums which I simply enjoy more as albums and also in terms of the songwriting. Sgt. Pepper's, for instance, has been overtaken at number 4 by Rubber Soul, maybe the best and most important transitional album of all times. This indeed is an album that has risen in my esteem over time. On this one, the Beatles clearly broke away from their teen pop years and the Mersey beat style. There is a stylistic variety on display here. The arrangements are getting more thought out, and the songwriting had developed in huge leaps. If you compare it to what else was released in 1965, this was a really groundbreaking and quite adventurous pop rock album. It's probably the first really perfect Beatles album in their studio canon, and the track listing reads a little bit like a little greatest hits compilation. Drive My Car is a fun opening track. Norwegian Wood is a sarcastic acoustic song by John Lennon featuring sitar. It's one of my favorites. Michelle is one of Paul McCartney's sugary ballads, but it really works very nicely in the context of this album. And then, of course, you have a masterpiece such as In My Life, or also Nowhere Man, for instance. Simply a very enjoyable album from start to finish. Number 3. And this is where I place the Beatles' true foray into psychedelia. I think it's even more psychedelic than Sgt. Pepper's Hearts Club Band. Magical Mystery Tour. The TV special with the same title was, well, sort of the first real flop for the Beatles. It's a very odd mixture of film experimentation, psychedelic images, and odd humor a la Monty Python. But the music compiled for this full-length album version is just, to me, absolutely outstanding for any fan of psychedelic rock music. Again, the title track is an overlooked classic, in my opinion. I Am the Walrus is an iconic example of psychedelic rock. There's a very eerie, very unusual song by George Harrison called Blue Jay Way, which is pretty disorienting and dark for Beatles material. And on the B-side, we get some of the best singles material in Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And there are also a lot of other real fun tracks. Paul McCartney's Fool on the Hill is a very evocative, somehow nostalgic tune. And I've always had a soft spot for the maybe a little bit repetitive but extremely catchy Baby, You're a Rich Man. If you want to know what psychedelia and swinging London was all about, I think Magical Mystery Tour is a trip worth taking. Which leaves me with only 2 more spots, and at my personal number 2, we find, well, maybe the beginning of the end for the Beatles, the huge ramshackle random collection of individual tracks, indeed individual because they often were recorded in parallel in separate studios by the single members of the band. But somehow all this chaotic hodgepodge makes for a fascinating double album. And of course, I talk about the Beatles, better known as the White Album. Fans always discuss very passionately about the perfect single album version of this album, arguing that there's too much fat that should have been trimmed. I think George Martin was of the same opinion. I think this album deserves to be the random, let's see what sticks at the wall type of double album that it is. And I like it just in that way, even though, yes, there are some throwaway tracks and some really questionable entries on this album. But, well, throughout this double album, you get a lot of unsung Beatles classics, almost in their approach to recording, as I would argue, foreshadowing do-it-yourself indie rock music. The album starts with the Beach Boys pastiche Back in the USSR, which is a great fun rock and roll track. Then we get John Lennon's absolutely gorgeous Dear Prudence. You get rather obnoxious pop songs like Obla Di Obla Da, crazy impromptu throwaway stuff such as Wild Honey Pie. Then again, epic rock tracks like George Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or gorgeous acoustic songs, Blackbird for instance, or Mother Nature's Son, John Lennon's very personal ballad Julia, and just some eccentric fun entries like Rocky Raccoon or George Harrison's Piggies. And of course, we also get Revolution 9, which is just beyond good and evil. I just have to tip my hat to the Beatles for simply being as bold as they were in putting this kind of avant-garde collage on their double album. The plain minimalist white cover, of course, also has become iconic, and I only can recommend to listen to this album in full at least once. I guess you will return time and time again to the White Album. So what's the number one spot? Of course, by means of deduction or exclusion, Beatles fans will know now, my personal number one is 1966's Revolver. It's a stylistically very varied collection of short songs that just bristle with energy and the joy of experimenting with styles, songwriting and studio technique. It's the first album by the Beatles that shows traces of psychedelia. It's also clearly more rock-oriented than its predecessor, Rubber Soul, and to me this shows the Beatles really at the height of their ability to present groundbreaking production and arrangement ideas, but at the same time stick to really catchy and concise pop songwriting. Almost any track on this album to me is perfect, from George Harrison's sarcastic Taxman to the chamber string ballad Eleanor Rigby, John Lennon's indeed sleepy psychedelic ballad I'm Only Sleeping, the trippy children's tune Yellow Submarine, mysterious rockers such as She Said, or the very short but energetic And Your Bird Can Sing, Paul McCartney's sunshine pop a la Good Day Sunshine, or his excursion into Motown soul, Got to Get You Into My Life. And of course, this album also includes maybe the most psychedelic and most important psychedelic track the Beatles ever recorded, the droning and mesmerizing Tomorrow Never Knows. This to me simply is a perfect album. Not the only perfect Beatles album, but my personal top spot. And if you'd like to hear me talk more in detail and at length about Revolver, check out the very first video I did for this channel. It's in German, but English subtitles are also available. Enough self-promotion. Thanks for listening. So that's my personal Beatles ranking list. Let me know yours. Let me know where you disagree in the comments. And I promise the next video will be something new again.